Declaro abierta la sesión número 8476 del Consejo de Seguridad. El orden del día provisional para esta sesión figura el siguiente tema: la situación en la República Bolivariana de Venezuela. Queda aprobado el orden del día. De conformidad con el artículo 37 del Reglamento Provisional del Consejo, invito al representante de la República Bolivariana de Venezuela a participar en esta sesión. Así queda acordado. El Consejo de Seguridad iniciará ahora el examen del tema 2 del orden del día. Los miembros del Consejo tienen ante sí dos documentos. El documento S/2019/186 y el documento S/2019/190, que contienen los textos de sendos proyectos de resolución. El Consejo está listo para someter a votación los proyectos de resolución que tienen ante sí. Daré ahora la palabra a los miembros del Consejo que deseen formular declaraciones antes de la votación. Doy la palabra al representante de la Federación Rusa. Doy las gracias al señor representante de la Federación Rusa.
Благодарю вас, господин председатель.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Перед нами
We have before
резолюция,
us
представленная
a resolution that has been presented by
Соединенными
the United States
Америки,
of
проект
America,
резолюции,
a
представленный
draft
Соединенными
resolution
Штатами
submitted
Америки.
by the United States of America.
Наконец-то мы дошли
We
до
have finally
кульминации
arrived at the culmination
американского
of the
спектакля
United
двойных
States
стандартов по
double
Венесуэле.
standards show on
Месяц назад и
Venezuela 1 month
позавчера в
ago
ходе
and the day before
заседания
yesterday
Совета
during a Security
Безопасности
Council
стало
meeting. It
абсолютно
became
очевидно, что
absolutely clear
большинство
that the
стран
majority
в
of
западном
countries
полушарии,
in the
вне
Western
зависимости от
Hemisphere,
политических предпочтений,
irrespective of their political
выступают за решение
affiliations,
проблем
advocate a
Венесуэлы
resolution to the
самими
problems in Venezuela
венесуэльцами на основе
by the
диалога.
Venezuelan people themselves on the basis of
Такой
dialogue.
общенациональный
Such
диалог,
nationwide
инклюзивный
dialogue,
общенациональный диалог,
inclusive
главное,
nationwide
что сейчас
dialogue
необходимо.
is the most
Но, к
important
сожалению,
thing right
Вашингтон
now. But
упорно идет к своей цели
unfortunately,
по эскалации
Washington is
напряженности и
obstinately
реализации
seeking
своего
to
сценария
escalate
по
tensions and to
неконституционной
implement
смене власти.
their scenario for an unconstitutional
Давайте
change of
посмотрим на
government or an
tекст
ouster of the
американского
government. Let us
проекта,
take a look at the text of the U.S.
за что
draft
Вашингтон
resolution,
предлагает Совету
for
Безопасности ООН
what
проголосовать.
exactly the United States is
И вот
proposing
за
that the
что.
Security Council
Признать
vote
парламент
for.
Национальной
And here
Ассамблеи
is what it
Венесуэлы,
is.
я цитирую,
Acknowledging the National
конституционной
Assembly of
властью,
Venezuela, and I quote,
а
the
президентские выборы,
constitutional authority
состоявшиеся в марте
and the
прошлого
presidential
года,
elections that were held
несвободными и
last
нечестными.
March
И это
to
спустя
deem them
год
to be
после
neither free
того,
nor fair.
как они
And this
состоялись.
1 year after they took
Именно ради
place.
этого США и
For the sake of
подготовили
this,
свою
the
резолюцию.
U.S. drafted
Лицемерная
the
забота о
resolution.
гуманитарном положении в стране – это всего лишь
Hypocritical concern of the
прикрытие.
humanitarian situation in the
Но,
country is a
возможно,
mere
у США есть и
smokescreen.
другая цель
But perhaps the United
–
States
войти в
has another
историю.
goal to enter
Если
into
бы эта
history.
резолюция была
Were this
принята,
resolution to be
это был бы первый
adopted, this
случай
would
в
be the
истории, когда
first
Совет
time in
Безопасности снял
history
бы с
when the
должности
Security Council
одного
would
и назначил
dismiss
другого президента
one
суверенной
and would
страны.
appoint another president
Это
of a
что,
sovereign
мировая
country.
демократия в действии?
Is this
Я
world
даже не говорю
diplomacy
здесь
in
о политической
action? I'm not even
составляющей. Это даже
speaking
не
of the
вопрос
political
о Мадуро
component
и
here.
Гуайдо.
This is not even a matter of Maduro and Guaido.
Неужели вы не
Do
понимаете,
you
что это
truly fail to
юридически безграмотно и
understand that
ничтожно?
this is legally
Это что, такой
untenable and null
тонкий
and void?
троллинг или
Is this
насмешка над
thinly
членами Совета
veiled
Безопасности?
trolling? Is it a mockery of
А те,
members
кто
of the Security
планирует
Council,
поддержать
those who
американский
plan to
проект, вы
support
понимаете,
the
что
U.S.
станете
draft? Do you
участниками юридического
understand
театра
that you
абсурда?
will become complicit in a legal theater of the absurd?
Американская
The U.S.
делегация не
delegation
может не отдавать
cannot
отчет о том,
but
что их
note
резолюция не
that
имеет
their
шансов быть
resolution
принятой.
has no chance of being
Тем не менее,
adopted.
они намеренно
Nonetheless,
выносят
they
ее в
are
Совет с тем, чтобы
deliberately
потом
tabling it at the
показывать
Council
пальцем
to
на
then
тех,
point a
кто
finger
якобы
at those
препятствует
who
установлению
allegedly are
демократии в
obstructing
Венесуэле.
the establishment of
Вы
democracy in
сейчас намеренно
Venezuela. You
подрываете
are now
единство
deliberately
Совета.
undermining the
Но
unity of
нужно
the
ли оно вам?
Council. But do you need this
Наши
unity?
американские
Our
коллеги,
U.S.
похоже,
colleagues
забыли, что
apparently
такое
have
международное
forgotten
право.
what
В
international
вашем
law is.
дипломатическом арсенале
You
остались только
only have
ультиматумы, санкции и угрозы
ultimatums,
применения
sanctions, and
силы.
threats of use of force left in your diplomatic
Мы, разумеется, отдаем
toolbox.
себе отчет
Of
в том,
course,
что это
we
все
note
затеяно
that
только
this
с
has
тем,
all been
чтобы обвинить
initiated
несогласные
solely
государства в
to accuse a
препятствовании
non-consenting state
доставке
of
помощи
obstructing
венесуэльцам.
the delivery of assistance
Но
to the
это
Venezuelan
снова
people. However,
пример
this is yet another
беззастенчивой
example of
пропаганды.
shameless
26
propaganda.
февраля
On
мы
26
подробно
February,
говорили о
we
том, что
spoke
Россия и
at
Китай
length and in detail of
свободно
the
и
fact
без
that
проблем
Russia and China
доставили
freely,
свою
without any
гуманитарную помощь
problems,
венесуэльцам.
delivered humanitarian
Не
assistance to the
получилось это
Venezuelan
только у
people.
Соединенных Штатов, которые
Only the U.S. didn't
пренебрегли
manage to do
суверенитетом
this.
и
They
неприкосновенностью границ
disregarded the
суверенных
sovereignty and
государств.
inviolability
Я
of the
сказал
borders
это
of the sovereign
позавчера и
state. I
повторю сегодня.
mentioned this the day before
Если бы
yesterday and will repeat
Соединенные
it
Штаты
today.
Америки
If the
действительно
United
хотели
States
помочь
were
народу Венесуэлы,
genuinely keen
то
to help the
действовали бы
people of
официально
Venezuela, then
через
they would
любое из
operate
аккредитованных в
through
этой стране
official
агентств
channels
ООН.
through any of the
Но цель не в
UN-accredited
этом.
agencies
Это
in that
только
country. But that's
прикрытие.
not their goal. This is
Цель
but
в
a
смене режима.
smokescreen. Their goal
Это,
is
наверное,
regime
самый
change.
яркий
This is
и
probably the
самый
most
прямой по
glaring,
смыслу
the most
случай
egregious, the most
реализации пресловутой
clear
концепции
instance of
гуманитарной
implementation
интервенции.
of the notorious
Интервенции с
concept of
гуманитарной
humanitarian intervention,
составляющей
intervention
и
with
под
humanitarian
гуманитарным предлогом.
component and with humanitarian
Такой
pretexts.
порядок, основанный на
Such
правилах,
a
вместо
rules-based
международного права,
order
нам
instead of
предлагает,
international law is what is being
и
proposed
об
to
этом
us.
постоянно
And
говорят нам
this
западные
is
коллеги.
consistently being talked about by
Именно
Western
поэтому
colleagues.
мы
For this
подготовили
very reason,
альтернативный
we
проект
drafted an
резолюции,
alternative
направленный
draft
не на
resolution, the aim
поощрение
of which is
политических
not
интриг и смену
to
режима,
stimulate,
а на реальную
not to
помощь
incite
венесуэльцам в их
political
усилиях по
intrigues and
нормализации
regime
обстановки в
change, but
стране.
rather to genuinely help the
Мы
Venezuelan
подчеркнули,
people
что
in their
любая
efforts to
международная
normalize the
помощь
situation in the country. We
должна
stress that
оказываться на
any
основе
international
принципов
assistance needs
гуманности,
to be delivered on the basis
нейтралитета,
of principles
нейтральности,
of
беспристрастности и
humanity,
независимости
neutrality, impartiality, and
и
independence,
согласия
and
законного правительства
the
страны.
consent of a country's
Более
legitimate
того,
government.
мы в нашем
Furthermore,
документе
in our
выразили
document, we
поддержку
extend
международным
support
посредническим
for
инициативам, включая
international mediation
механизм Монтевидео,
initiatives, including
которые
the
помогли бы
Montevideo
венесуэльцам
mechanism,
достигнуть
which would
самого
help
важного
the Venezuelan
сейчас
people
–
to achieve what
политического
is most
регулирования.
important now,
Ничего
namely
подобного
political
в американском
settlement.
проекте просто
The
нет,
U.S. draft
потому
simply
что
has
он направлен
nothing
не на
of the
то, чтобы
sort
решать
because
проблемы.
it is not geared towards resolving the
Вчера мы собрали
problems.
экспертные
Yesterday, we
консультации по нашему
convened
тексту,
expert-level
выслушали мнение
consultations
государственных
on our
членов Совета
text. We
Безопасности,
listened to the
включая
views of members of the
американского
Security Council,
представителя.
including the U.S.
Мы не
representative.
услышали ни одного
We
конкретного замечания
heard
по
not
нашему
a
проекту.
single specific
Западные
comment
эксперты
on our draft.
сказали, что
Western
не будут работать
experts
по
said
нашему
that they
тексту.
would not
А
work on our
американские
text.
коллеги тут же
And U.S.
выставили свой
colleagues
проект на голосование.
immediately tabled their
В чем
draft
здесь дипломатия? В чем
for the
поиск
vote.
компромисса?
Where is diplomacy here?
Вся
Where
эта
is the quest for
комбинация только
compromise? This is
пропагандистский
all
пиар, во
a
многом продиктованный
combination of
внутриполитическими
publicity,
соображениями.
largely
Сожалеем,
dictated
что в
by
него
domestic
вновь увлекает
political
Совет Безопасности.
concerns and agendas. We regret the fact that the Security Council has once again been dragged into this.
Мы всерьез опасаемся того,
We
что
are
сегодняшнее
seriously
заседание
concerned with the fact
может
that
быть
today's
использовано
meeting
как
may
этап
be
подготовки
exploited as a
реальной,
step
а не
for
гуманитарной
preparations of a
интервенции,
real,
как
not
предлог
humanitarian
для внешнего
intervention,
вмешательства
as a
по причине
pretext for
якобы
external intervention
неспособности
for the,
Совета Безопасности
as a result of
урегулировать
the
ситуацию в
alleged
Венесуэле.
inability of the Security Council to resolve the
Хотим
situation
вновь
in Venezuela.
обратиться
We
к
wish
тем
once
членам
again to
Совета
turn to
Безопасности
those
ООН,
members of the Security
кто хочет
Council
реально
who
помочь,
genuinely wish to
не
lend
потворствовать
assistance,
этому политическому
not
шоу.
to become
Мы призываем
complicit in this
проголосовать против
political show. We
американского
call for
проекта и
all
поддержать
to
наш
vote
документ,
against the
который
U.S. draft, to
специально
support
составлен
our
так, чтобы
document, which
избежать
has been
формулировок,
specifically
которые
drafted
вызывают
to
разногласия и
avoid
полностью
wording
направлен
that
на реальную помощь
creates a
венесуэльцам,
dissent and
на
is
международную помощь и
genuinely
международное
geared towards
посредничество.
helping
Благодарю.
the Venezuelan people for advancement of international assistance and international mediation.
Doy
Thank
las
you.
gracias al señor representante de la Federación de
I
Rusia.
thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement.
En primer lugar, procederé a
We
someter
shall
a votación
first proceed to
el
submit
proyecto
to
de
the
resolución
vote
que figura en el
the draft
documento
resolution contained
S
in document
2019-186
S-2019-186,
presentado por los
submitted
Estados
by the
Unidos de
United
América.
States of America.
Quienes estén a favor del proyecto
All
de
those in
resolución
favor of the
que
draft
figura en el
resolution
documento
contained in document S-2019-186
186, sírvanse levantar la
please
mano.
raise their hand.
En contra.
Against?
Abstención.
Abstentions?
El resultado de la
The
votación
result of
es
the
el
voting
siguiente.
is as follows.
Votos a favor,
Votes in
9.
favour, 9.
Votos en contra,
Votes against?
3.
3.
Abstenciones,
Abstentions?
3.
3.
El proyecto de resolución,
The draft
No ha sido
resolution
aprobado
has not been adopted
debido al voto negativo de un miembro
owing to the
permanente
negative vote
del
of a
Consejo.
permanent member of the
O
Council.
bien, el proyecto no ha sido aprobado,
It is
como
not
explicaron.
it has not been approved, as I stated.
Daré ahora la
I
palabra
now
a los
give
miembros
the
del
floor
Consejo que
to
deseen
members of the Council
formular
who wish
declaraciones
to make statements
después de la votación.
following the vote.
Doy la palabra al señor
I give
representante
the
de
floor
Estados
to the
Unidos.
representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. The situation in Venezuela demands our action now. The corrupt former Maduro regime has caused an economic collapse that threatens peace and security throughout the region. Millions of Venezuelans have fled their country in search of food, medicine, and opportunity. The time for a peaceful transition to democracy is now. Each member of the international community that joins in recognizing the Guaido government is supporting the people of Venezuela as they strive to reclaim their democracy. Mr. President, regrettably, by voting against this resolution, some members of this council continue to shield Maduro and his cronies and prolong the suffering of the Venezuelan people. This man-made crisis has extended well beyond Venezuela's borders and threatens to destabilize the region. Events from this past weekend show that Maduro will stop at nothing to maintain power, including the use of gang violence against unarmed Venezuelan citizens. Mr. President, regardless of the results of today's vote, this resolution shows that democracies around the world, and especially in Latin America, are mobilizing behind interim President Guaido. The United States will remain steadfast in our support for the legitimate Guaido government and the National Assembly. We look forward to genuinely free and fair elections and to a government that reflects the will and aspirations of the Venezuelan people. The United States will pursue all avenues to increase humanitarian assistance to Venezuelans, both inside and outside their country. There was, in fact, an additional aid delivery today to the border region, Cucuta, Colombia, emergency medical kits for 40,000 people, high nutrition food for enough for 10,000 infants for 2 months, hygiene kits for 35,000 people. I would like to take this opportunity to reiterate our concern about the safety and security of interim President Juan Guaido when he returns to Venezuela, and we hope that all members of the Council will join us in doing so. Now is the time to strengthen our commitment to the Venezuelan people. We call on members of the Security Council to join in this commitment, and I'd like to express satisfaction that a clear majority of the Council did so today. Thank you.
Doy las gracias al señor representante de
I
Estados
thank
Unidos.
the representative of the
Ahora voy a dar
United
la
States.
palabra al señor
I now
representante
give the
de
floor
Perú.
to the representative
Señor
of Peru.
presidente, el Perú ha votado
Mr.
a
President,
favor de la resolución sobre la
Peru
situación en
voted in
Venezuela
favor of the
a fin de
resolution
permitir que el
on
Consejo de
Venezuela in
Seguridad,
order to
en
enable
el
the Security
ejercicio de las
Council
facultades que
in
le otorga la
exercise of
Carta de
the
la
mandate given
Organización,
to it under the Charter of
adopte
the
una
organization,
decisión que
adopt
contribuya a
a
la
decision
paz
which
y
will
seguridad
contribute to
regionales,
regional peace and
tal
security,
como lo espera la comunidad
as
internacional.
is hoped for
Lamentamos
by the international
profundamente la
community.
falta de
We
unidad de este
very much
Consejo
regret the lack of
para
unity in this
contribuir
council
a abordar la
to
situación en
contribute to
Venezuela
assessing the
que
situation in
representa una
Venezuela,
amenaza
which
sin
represents
precedentes
an
a la paz,
unprecedented threat
seguridad,
to
libertad y
peace,
prosperidad de
security,
toda la
and
región,
prosperity of the whole
a
region.
evitar nuevos escalamientos de violencia
We
y
need to
a
avoid
atender
new
la
escalations
terrible
of
crisis
violence and
humanitaria que
address the serious
padece ese
humanitarian
país.
situation being suffered in
Ello
the country.
resulta aún más
And it's
incomprensible
even
cuando se
more
trataba de un texto
incomprehensible
mínimo
when this is a
que en aras del
minimum
consenso
text
había evitado mencionar
which,
aspectos tan
with a view to
relevantes como
consensus,
las
did not
constantes
mention relevant
violaciones
aspects such
a
as
los
the
derechos
constant
humanos y a las
violations of
libertades
human rights and
fundamentales,
fundamental
la terrible
freedoms,
situación
the
humanitaria que
terrible
padece la
humanitarian
población,
situation being suffered by
sobre
the
todo los más
population,
vulnerables,
particularly
la
the most
ruptura del orden
vulnerable, the
democrático, la corrupción
breakdown in a
endémica y el
democratic
colapso
order,
económico y
the
el
economic
éxodo de más
collapse,
de
and the exodus
3.4
of more than
millones de venezolanos
3.4 million
que huyeron de esa
Venezuelans
terrible
who
realidad.
have fled
Sin
this
embargo,
terrible reality.
nos alienta
However,
constatar
we
que la
are encouraged to
mayoría de
see
los
that the
miembros de este
majority of
Consejo
members of this
han
council
reafirmado su
have
compromiso y
reaffirmed their
solidaridad con el
commitment and
hermano pueblo
solidarity with the
venezolano
brotherly
y su plena
people of
disposición por
Venezuela,
continuar
and that they
propiciando el
will continue
restablecimiento de la
to
democracia
work
en dicho
towards the
país,
reestablishment of democracy in that
aspiración
country,
que
an
solo será
aspiration which
posible
will only
a
be
través de la
possible
pronta
through
celebración de elecciones
the
libres,
holding of
justas,
free,
creíbles
just, credible,
y abiertas a
and
la
open
participación de todas las
elections
fuerzas
with the
políticas,
participation of all
con el
political parties as soon as
acompañamiento y
possible,
observación internacional
with
que
international
permita
observers involved, which
cristalizar
will
el
make it
derecho de todos
possible
los venezolanos a
to
vivir en democracia y libertad.
ensure
Gracias.
that all Venezuelans are
Doy
able to
las
live in freedom
gracias
and
al señor
democracy. Thank you. I
representante de
thank the
Perú.
representative of Peru.
Ahora paso la
I
palabra
now
al
give the
señor
floor to
representante
the
de China.
representative of China.
主席先生，
Mr. President,
中方高度关注
China pays close
委内瑞拉
attention
局
to the
势，
situation in Venezuela,
支持委内瑞
and
拉
China
政府
supports the Venezuelan
为
government
维护国家主
in its
权、
efforts to safeguard
独立
its national
和
sovereignty,
稳定
independence,
所
and
做努力。
stability.
委内瑞拉事务
The
应
Venezuelan
该
affairs
由委内
should
瑞
be
拉人民
decided by
自
the
主决
Venezuelan
定。
people.
中方在安理会设
At
委
the
内瑞
Security
拉问
Council,
题上的出发点是
On the Venezuela issue, our
维
starting
护
point
联合
is to
国宪
uphold
章
the
精神
spirit of the UN
和
Charter
国际关系基
and the
本
basic
准则，
principles governing international
推动
relations,
委内瑞拉问题
promote
的
a
和平
peaceful
解决，
settlement of the Venezuela issue,
维护拉美地
and
区的
maintain
长期和
long-term
平稳
peace,
定与
stability,
发展。
and development in Latin America.
中方反对外
China
部势力干
opposes
涉
external
委内
forces
瑞拉内政，
interfering in Venezuela
反
internal
对
affairs,
对委内
and
瑞拉
opposes
进行
military
军事干预。
intervention in Venezuela.
令人遗憾的是，
It is regrettable
我们面前的这份
that
决
the
议
draft
草案
resolution before
与
us
中方上述立
is
场
seriously inconsistent with
严
the
重不符。
China's principles position as
中
stated
方
above.
不得不投了反对票
Therefore,。China had to vote against it.
中方呼吁委
China
内
calls
瑞
upon the
拉朝
Venezuelan
野各
government
方
and opposition
在
parties
宪法和
to
法律
seek a
框架
political
内，
solution through
通过
dialogue
对
and
话协商
consultation within the
寻求政治
constitutional
解决方
and
案。
legal framework.
希望国际社
We
会
hope the international
做真正
community
有
will
利
do
于委内
things
瑞拉
that truly
国家
favor
稳
the
定、
stability
经济
and
发展、
economic development of
民生
Venezuela,
改善的事情。
things that are conducive to the
在尊
improvement
重
of
委
people's
内瑞拉主
livelihood
权
in
前
the
提下，
country. On the
向委内
premise
瑞拉
of respecting
提
the
供
sovereignty
建
of
设性帮
Venezuela,
助，
we should provide
推
constructive
动
assistance
有
to the
关问
country
题尽
to
快平
promote a
稳解
smooth
决。
resolution of relevant issues as soon as
安理
possible.
会在委内瑞拉
Any
问题
actions
上
taken by the
采
Security
取的
Council
任何
on
行动，
Venezuela
都应当
should be
符
in
合上
line
述
with
原
the
则。
above principles.
谢谢主席先
And I
生。
thank you, Mr. President.
Doy las gracias al señor
I thank
representante
the
de China.
representative of China.
Ahora doy la palabra al
I
señor
now give the floor to
representante
the
de Bélgica.
representative of Belgium.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
La Belgique a voté
Belgium
en faveur de ce projet
voted
de résolution
in favor of this
sur la
draft
situation au
resolution on the
Venezuela
situation in
présentée par les
Venezuela,
États-Unis.
the draft resolution that
Elle
has
l'a
been
fait
submitted by
parce
the
que
United
cette
States. We did
résolution
so because this
contient les éléments
resolution
essentiels d'une sortie de
incorporates the
crise
critical
point de
components
vue de la
of
Belgique
resolving this,
et de l'Union
this
européenne.
crisis in the view of both
Un
Belgium and the
processus
European
politique
Union,
pacifique,
namely a peaceful
des
political
élections
process,
présidentielles libres, régulières
fair,
et
free,
crédibles,
and credible
avec
presidential
observation
elections
électorale
with
internationale,
international
conformément à la
electoral
Constitution
observation
du
in line
Venezuela.
with the Venezuelan
Un
constitution,
encouragement des initiatives pacifiques,
encouragement of
inclusives et
inclusive,
crédibles,
peaceful, and credible
la sécurité des citoyens
initiatives,
et acteurs
safety and
politiques
security of,
vénézuéliens
Venezuelan
et
citizens
enfin
and
l'accès
political
sans entrave
actors,
de l'aide
and
humanitaire
lastly, unfettered
dans le
access for
respect des
humanitarian
principes
aid
humanitaires.
in line with humanitarian
La
principles.
Belgique a aussi
Belgium
soutenu cette
also
résolution
supported this
parce
resolution
que rien dans son
because
texte
nothing
n'est de
in
nature à
its
justifier le
text
recours à la force
justifies the use
et
of
parce qu'elle
force,
prône une recherche
and
de
because
solutions
the text
pacifiques.
advocates seeking a
Nous
peaceful
regrettons
solution.
que certains aient
We
bloqué
regret
ces
the fact
perspectives.
that some have obstructed this.
Alors que ce Conseil
As
s'apprête
the
à voter
Security
sur un
Council
texte
prepares
concurrent,
to vote on
je souhaite
another
faire part
draft,
de l'intention
a
de ma
competing
délégation
draft, I wish
de
to
voter
voice our
contre
intent to
cet autre
vote
texte.
against this other
Il y
text.
manque en effet un
Indeed,
élément
this
essentiel.
text lacks a critical
Pour la
element
Belgique comme pour l'Union
for
européenne,
Belgium,
la solution à la
as
crise
well as for the
vénézuélienne
European
passe
Union.
par
The solution to
l'organisation
the
d'élections
Venezuelan crisis hinges
présidentielles libres,
on the
régulières
organization
et
of
crédibles.
fair, free, and
Le
credible
peuple
presidential
vénézuélien a déjà
elections.
trop souffert.
The Venezuelan
Il
people
est
have
grand temps de
suffered
le
for far
laisser
too long
décider
already.
de son
The
avenir.
time is ripe, and it is
Nous
indeed past
exprimons
time to
également nos
allow them to
réserves quant au
decide their
paragraphe
future.
3
We also have
de ce projet
reservations
de
regarding
résolution
paragraph
et
3
soulignons
of this
l'importance
resolution.
d'une
We
aide
stress the
humanitaire
importance
conforme
of
aux principes
humanitarian
d'humanité,
assistance
de
in line with the
neutralité,
principles of humanity,
d'impartialité et
neutrality,
d'indépendance.
impartiality, and
Il est
independence.
inacceptable
It is
que des
not
groupes armés
acceptable
irréguliers
for
intimident
rogue
les civils et les
armed
membres de
groups
l'Assemblée
to
nationale
intimidate
qui se sont
civilians and members
mobilisés
of the National
pour
Assembly who
distribuer
have
de l'aide.
mobilized to distribute
remercie.
assistance. Thank you.
Agradezco al señor representante
I
de
thank
Bélgica
the
por su
representative
intervención.
of Belgium for
Ahora
his
paso la
statement.
palabra
I now
al
give the floor to the
representante de la
representative
República
of the
Dominicana.
Dominican Republic.
Buenas tardes, señor presidente.
Good afternoon, Mr.
Queremos
President.
intervenir
We wanted
para
to
razonar
take
nuestro
the
voto en
floor
dos sentidos.
to explain our vote
Primero,
in two regards. First
expresar
of
que
all,
para la República
to state
Dominicana
that for the
no hay
Dominican
otra
Republic,
solución
there is
posible
no
a la
other
crisis en
possible
Venezuela
solution to the
que la
crisis in Venezuela
celebración
other
sin
than
demora
the
de
holding
elecciones
without
libres
delay
y
of
competitivas,
free and competitive
con garantías
elections
para todos los
with
grupos y
guarantees for
actores.
all groups and political
Este
stakeholders.
proceso político,
This political,
pacífico e
peaceful and
inclusivo
inclusive
tendrá que
process
dar paso a que la sociedad venezolana
must lead
se
to
reconcilie
Venezuelan
consigo misma
society becoming
y supere
reconciled
las
with itself and
diferencias que han
overcoming the
generado
differences
estas
that have
situaciones
led to
de
these
tensión
situations
permanente,
of permanent tension,
atentando contra el pueblo
negatively
venezolano
affecting
y
the
el entorno
Venezuelan people and the regional
regional.
environment.
Por ende, y
Finally,
para evitar
and in order
suspicacia,
to avoid any
para
suspicion,
nosotros no es
as
una
far as we are
opción
concerned,
el uso de la
the use
fuerza.
of force is not an
Por el
option.
contrario,
On the contrary,
favorecemos un
what
diálogo
we favor is
inclusivo
an inclusive
en el que
dialogue
participen todos los actores
in which all
políticos
political
y la sociedad
stakeholders
civil,
and civil society will
paso
participate. This
indispensable
is an
para una
indispensable
salida
step
pacífica,
towards a peaceful
democrática
and
y
democratic
respetuosa de los derechos
outcome
humanos.
to the situation respectful of
Finalmente,
human rights.
entendemos
Finally,
que es
we believe
preciso crear las
that we need to
condiciones
create
para
the
dar respuesta
conditions
a
in order
quienes
to
requieren
provide assistance to
asistencia
those who
debido a la
require
grave
it due
crisis
to the
humanitaria
serious
que
humanitarian
aqueja a los
crisis
venezolanos.
afflicting Venezuelans. Thank you very much.
Le doy las gracias al
I
señor
thank
representante
the
de la
representative
República
of the
Dominicana
Dominican Republic.
y ahora paso la
I
palabra
now give
al
the
señor
floor to the
representante de
representative
Sudáfrica.
of South Africa.
Mr. President, we want to take the floor to explain our vote. South Africa has made its position clear on the situation in Venezuela when we addressed this council 2 days ago. We reiterate our view that inclusive political dialogue is necessary to resolve the political crisis in Venezuela. We remain concerned at the serious humanitarian situation in the country and support the United Nations' efforts to provide humanitarian assistance to alleviate the hardships experienced by the people of Venezuela. Mr. President, the way is concerned at the irregular procedure in tabling resolution before us. The dispensing of 48-hour practice for the consideration of the draft undermines due process and our ability to meaningfully engage on the text to reach consensus. We have before us two divergent resolutions on the situation in Venezuela. This is unfortunate. South Africa believes that the Council should be unified in its approach to supporting the people of Venezuela in finding a solution to the crisis. We must speak with one voice in assisting Venezuelan people in weathering the humanitarian challenges faced as a result of political and economic difficulties in their country. However, instead of bringing the Council and the people of Venezuela together, The relations illustrates how far this council is from contributing to deal with the crisis. The lack of unity of the council on this matter widens the divisions and undermines the credibility of this council to make a meaningful contribution in the solution of Venezuela. Ideally, Mr. President, the council should adopt a resolution that will facilitate internal, inclusive, political dialogue among the people in determining their own way out of their political and economic difficulties. Furthermore, a council resolution should facilitate the provision of international assistance based on the principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and based on and through the accurate needs assessment. Thus, the provision of aid should be depoliticized and meet the needs of people of Venezuela. The President, while the resolution presented by the United States call for a peaceful political process, it is prescriptive on the outcome of this process and thus infringing on the sovereignty of Venezuela. Internal political process should remain the national prerogative of member states. From the outset, we can encourage parties to engage in a political dialogue, but we cannot dictate outcome of such as the holding of elections. Furthermore, the context of the crisis set out in the proposed resolution does not reflect a balanced understanding of the underpinning of the crisis in Venezuela. There are three elements in the U.S. resolution that are antithetical to the principles and values that underpin South African democratic dispensation and our foreign policy. First, in the preambular paragraph 4, regarding the authority of the National Assembly to release political prisoners and grant amnesty, South Africa view this as a tantamount to the national, in the principle of the separation of powers, on which South African Constitution is predicated on. Therefore, South Africa cannot support, at the international level, the violation of this universal, sacrosanct, and inviolable principle that underpin the governance of the modern states. Second, South Africa cannot also support opening paragraph 1, which expressed deep concern that the presidential election in May 2018 were neither free nor fair. President Nicolas Maduro was elected for a second 6-year term in a presidential election on May 20, according to the National Election Council, CNE, of Venezuela. President Maduro was re-elected by a wide margin, getting over 5.8 million votes, according to TBC Luen, the president of CNE. His closest challenger, Henry Falcon, received about 1.8 million ballots, and the third place candidate, Javier Botishin, got 925,042 votes. Over 8.6 million Venezuela went to the polls, putting voter turnout at 46.1%. The announcement was made when the CNA counted more than 92% ballots. South Africa respects the authority of CNA as the constitutional mandate body that is charged with the management of the electoral process in Venezuela, like in all our countries. This body declared Maduro a winner, and this should be respected like we do in all other election processes elsewhere in the world. This is the basis on which President Maduro enjoys legitimacy and international recognition. Third and final, South Africa believes that opening paragraph 4 is partisan and biased, as it stresses the importance of only ensuring security of the members of the National Assembly and members of the political opposition. A UN resolution cannot stress the security of certain sector to the exclusion of the others. As an impartial body, the UN should insist on the security of all Venezuelans. South Africa was not in a position to support the U.S. resolution. I thank you.
Doy las gracias al señor
I
representante de
thank the
Sudáfrica
representative of South
por su
Africa
intervención.
for his statement.
Someteré ahora a votación
I will now
el proyecto de
submit to the
resolución
vote
que figura en el
the draft
documento
resolution,
S/2019/190
S/2019/190,
presentado por la Federación de Rusia.
presented by the Russian Federation.
Quienes estén a favor del
Those in
proyecto de
favour
resolución
of the
que
draft
figura en el
resolution
documento
contained in document
S/2019/190
S/2019/190,
sírvanse levantar la mano.
please raise their hands.
En contra,
Those against?
abstenciones.
Abstentions?
El resultado
The
de
result
la votación
of the voting
es el siguiente.
is as follows.
4 votos a favor,
4 votes in favour,
7 votos en contra,
7 votes against,
4 votos en abstención.
4 abstentions.
El proyecto de resolución
The draft resolution
no ha sido
has
aprobado
not been adopted,
por no haber obtenido
having
el
failed
número de
to
votos
obtain
requerido.
the required number of votes.
Daré ahora la palabra a los miembros del Consejo que deseen formular
I now give the floor
declaraciones
to members of the Council
después de la
who would like to
votación.
make
En
statements
primer lugar, doy la
following the
palabra
vote. And
a la
first of all,
señora
I give the floor
representante
to
del
the
Reino Unido.
representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. President. As is clear, the United Kingdom voted in favour of the American text and against the Russian one. I think the fact that the Russian resolution failed, whereas the American text was vetoed, accurately pinpoints the unease that very many members of the United Nations feel about the situation in Venezuela and how untenable it is for it to continue. We were content, Mr. President, to vote in favour of the US text because it addressed important issues in Venezuela about which we too are concerned. It emphasised the importance of establishing the necessary conditions for a new and credible electoral process in Venezuela. Despite the Russian polemic, the US text did not seek a permanent transfer of power to a different leader. It called for free and fair elections, and we believe in that also, Mr. President. We believe that the Maduro presidency is illegitimate, and the National Assembly President Juan Guaido is constitutionally interim president of Venezuela, until credible, free and fair elections can be held. And these elections, Mr. President, are conditions on the part of transition to peace. Secondly, the resolution acknowledged deep concern about violence and the use of excessive force by the security forces in Venezuela against unarmed, peaceful protesters, including those, Mr. President, actively engaged in getting humanitarian assistance into the country to the benefit of ordinary citizens. There's clear evidence that liberty and justice have been systematically dismantled by Maduro's regime. And finally, Mr. President, the text addressed the economic collapse brought about by Maduro's corrupt policies, which led to the humanitarian crisis that has so far forced over 3.5 million Venezuelans to leave their country for other countries in the region. This has placed huge strain on the social services of their neighbours. We would like to thank the United States as penholder on this resolution for drafting a text that properly recognises the gravity of the situation in Venezuela. There are limits, Mr. President, as to how far a government can inflict damage and suffering on its own people. Turning to the Russian text, the United Kingdom was compelled to vote against the resolution proposed by the Russian Federation today. We fundamentally disagreed with its content because it pretended that there were threats to use force against the territorial integrity and political independence of Venezuela. There have been no threats to Venezuela's political independence or territorial integrity. Secondly, the resolution focused on alleged attempts to intervene in Venezuela's domestic affairs. As we have seen, Mr. President, the crisis has spilled far beyond Venezuela's borders, and the current situation in Venezuela represents a clear threat to peace and security in the region. Thirdly, the text included a selective reading of the UN Charter, one that we have heard before. It presents a biased interpretation of the events unfolding in Venezuela and its support of the Maduro regime. A full reading of the UN Charter, Mr. President, would show that the Security Council should cooperate to address the suffering of the Venezuelan people. Finally, Mr. President, the text failed to explicitly recognise two crucial aspects of the situation in Venezuela: the humanitarian crisis, I should say the man-made humanitarian crisis brought about by corrupt economic policies, and the need for free, fair and credible elections. Thank you, Mr. President.
Doy las gracias a la señora
I
representante
thank the
del Reino Unido.
representative of the United
Ahora doy la
Kingdom.
palabra al excelentísimo
give the
señor
floor
Walter Lindner,
to His
secretario de
Excellency Walter
Estado de la
Lindner,
Oficina
Secretary of State
Federal
of the
de
Federal
Relaciones
Office of
Exteriores
Foreign
de Alemania.
Relations of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me explain why we voted in favor of the draft resolution of the United States of America and against the Russian resolution. We supported the US text because the text recognizes the dire humanitarian situation, a man-made humanitarian situation, respects the sovereignty of Venezuela and conforms with the European Union's call for free, credible and transparent elections, and promotes a peaceful political solution to the crisis. As for the text of the Russian Federation, it does not present a solution for the crisis. It supports a government, the Maduro regime, which does not represent the Venezuelan population and refuses to recognize the humanitarian emergency of its population. The text also includes unspecific allegations of violations of the UN Charter, while, however, efforts here in this Council and of the international community do not constitute an interference with international affairs of a sovereign country. Also, serious humanitarian rights violations by the Maduro regime, plus the 3.5 million refugees fleeing from Venezuela to Colombia, Brazil, and even Peru and other countries, made the situation in Venezuela a threat to the stability and security in the entire region. We want to recall our main aims for Venezuela. We condemn the use of force. Second, the origins of the ongoing crisis in Venezuela are political. Hence, the solution can only be a political one. An inclusive and political, peaceful solution to the crisis must therefore urgently be found. Third, the stress to need to respond to the humanitarian needs of the Venezuelan people, and there is a humanitarian crisis, and alleviate the suffering of the most vulnerable. Fourth, we strongly renew our call for a peaceful restoration of democracy through free, transparent and credible presidential presidential elections in accordance with international democratic standards and Venezuelan constitutional order. Thank you, Mr. President.
Doy las gracias al excelentísimo señor
I
secretario de
thank His
Estado
Excellency State
de la
Secretary
República Alemana por su intervención.
of Germany for his
Ahora
statement.
paso la palabra
I now
al
give
señor
the floor
representante
to
de Francia.
Representative of France.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very
Monsieur
much,
le
Mr.
Président,
President.
Mr.
nous
President,
regrettons
we
les deux vétos
regret
contre le projet de
two
résolution
vetoes
américain,
against the U.S. draft resolution.
un projet qui aurait pu
A draft
contribuer
resolution that could
à une
have
solution
contributed
politique
to
et pacifique
a
de la crise
political
au
and
Venezuela
peaceful resolution
et
to the
soulager les
crisis in
souffrances du
Venezuela,
peuple
and that
vénézuélien
could have
à l'heure où il
eased
est
the plight
confronté à
of
l'une
the Venezuelan
des pires
people as
crises
they find
humanitaires de son
themselves
histoire.
facing one of the worst humanitarian crises in their
Contrairement à ce que
history.
nous avons entendu
Contrary
autour
to
de
what
cette
we have
table,
heard here,
le texte américain
the
qui a pris en
US
compte
text,
plusieurs de nos demandes,
which has accounted for a number of
ne
our
constitue
demands,
ni une base juridique
neither
en vue d'un
is
recours à la
a
force,
legal basis for the use of
ni une
force,
tentative
nor
de
is an
porter atteinte
attempt to
à la souveraineté du Venezuela.
undermine Venezuelan sovereignty.
Comme chacun le sait, la
As
France,
all are
comme
aware,
l'ensemble de l'Union
France,
européenne,
as is the case
n'a
with the
cessé de
whole of the
rappeler son
European
refus
Union,
de l'usage de la
consistently
force
recalled its
pour résoudre la
repudiation
crise
of force
vénézuélienne.
being used to resolve the
le dis en
Venezuelan
écho
crisis,
à ce que
and
vient
I
de dire le
echo
secrétaire d'État
what has
allemand
been
aux Affaires
stated
étrangères.
by the German State
Le
Secretary.
texte pour lequel nous avons
The
voté
text
reflète
for
non
which we
seulement
voted
la réalité
not
tragique
only
du
reflects
Venezuela
the
d'aujourd'hui,
tragic reality in Venezuela
mais aussi notre
today,
engagement à une
but it also
résolution
reflects our commitment
pacifique et
to a
politique
peaceful
de cette
and a
crise.
political settlement to this crisis.
Comme de nombreux États l'ont souligné
As
mardi
has
dernier,
been
y compris la
stressed on
France,
Tuesday by a number of
l'organisation
states,
d'élections
including
présidentielles
France,
libres,
the
crédibles et
organization of
transparentes
free, credible,
doit
and
être l'objectif
transparent
prioritaire
elections needs to be
en
the
vue du
paramount
rétablissement de la
priority
démocratie
with a view
vénézuélienne.
to restoring
Il s'agit
democracy
bien
in
d'apporter
Venezuela.
une solution
This
politique
is critical to
à
deliver
une crise
political
politique.
settlement to a
C'est toute la raison
political
d'être du groupe de
crisis.
contact
This is the
international
reason for the
lancé
existence
par
of the
l'Union
International
européenne et
Contact
l'Uruguay,
Group, which has been launched
dont la
by the
France
European
est
Union and
membre.
Uruguay, of which
La
France is a
position des
member.
pays qui ont bloqué ce
The
projet de
position of those
résolution
countries that have
après avoir
blocked this
refusé de
draft
participer
resolution
aux
after having
négociations
refused to participate in
revient à
negotiations
protéger le régime
amounts
de Nicolas
to
Maduro.
protection for
La
the
France, comme
Maduro
la majorité
regime.
des États membres
France,
du Conseil,
as is the case with the
estime
majority of
qu'il est
member
de
states
la
of the Council,
responsabilité
is of
du
the
Conseil
view
de
that
sécurité
it is
de condamner
incumbent upon the
fermement le
Security
blocage de
Council
l'aide
to
humanitaire,
emphatically
ainsi que le
condemn
recours à la
a
violence
blockage of
contre des
humanitarian
femmes et
aid
des
and the
hommes
use of
dont le seul
violence
crime
against
est
women
de
and
vouloir
men whose
porter
sole
aide et
crime was,
assistance à leurs
was
compatriotes.
seeking to deliver
Le
assistance
recours au
to
veto
their fellow
aujourd'hui a
countrymen.
bien pour
The
effet
use of the
de
veto
protéger un
today
régime décidé
may
à affamer son peuple.
protect a regime that
À
has
l'inverse,
decided
Monsieur
to
le Président,
starve its people.
le texte
The
présenté
text
par la
presented by
Russie
the Russian Federation
n'apporte manifestement aucune solution à la crise
patently does
actuelle.
not deliver on any
Il entretient
solution to the current
l'illusion que le
crisis.
Venezuela
It advances
est
the
dans une
illusion
situation
and maintains the
paisible
illusion that the
et
situation
agite le
in
spectre de l'invasion
Venezuela
étrangère,
is peaceful,
alors
and
que
it
3,5 millions
introduces the specter of a
migrants et de
foreign
réfugiés
intervention
ont
at a
quitté le
time when
pays
3.5
et
million
qu'une
migrants and
majorité de la
refugees
population est
have
plongée dans le
fled the
dénuement le
country,
plus total.
and more than
Le projet
the
russe n'a pas
majority
un
of
mot
the
pour
people
ces
have been
dizaines de millions de
plunged into
personnes.
utter
Pas
destitution.
une fois n'apparaît le
There
mot
is
humanitaire
not
dans
a
ce
single
projet.
word in the Russian draft resolution for these
Or,
millions of
l'accès
people.
de la
The
population
word humanitarian does
vénézuélienne
not
à une aide
appear,
internationale
and yet
neutre, transparente
access
et indépendante
for Venezuelan people
est une urgence
to
absolue.
neutral, transparent, and independent international
Monsieur le
aid
Président,
is crucially
l'impasse
urgent.
d'aujourd'hui
Mr. President, the
ne doit pas,
deadlock
ne peut pas
we have
nous
before us
conduire
today
à nous résigner.
mustn't and cannot lead us
La France
to
poursuivra
throw in
ses
the
efforts
towel.
à travers
France will
notamment
persevere in its
le groupe de
efforts
contact
inter alia through the
international.
International Contact
C'est
Group.
dans cet esprit que je veux
And in
réitérer
this
ici notre
spirit,
appel
here
à
I
une sortie de
reiterate
crise
our call
pacifique
for a
et négociée
peaceful,
qui
negotiated
implique
settlement to the
l'organisation
crisis.
d'élections
This
présidentielles
requires
libres,
the organization
crédibles et
of free, credible,
transparentes
and
dans
transparent
les plus
presidential
brefs délais,
elections as soon as
ainsi qu'un libre
possible,
accès
as well as
de l'aide
free access
humanitaire.
for humanitarian aid.
Alors que le Venezuela
At a
est
time
aujourd'hui au
when
bord du
Venezuela
gouffre,
finds itself today at the
notre
brink
responsabilité
of the
n'est
abyss,
ni
our
de nous
responsibility
substituer
is
au
neither
peuple
to
vénézuélien,
supplant the
ni de
Venezuelan people,
décider à sa
nor
place.
to
Elle
decide
est au
in their
contraire de
stead.
lui
On
redonner
the
la parole
contrary, it is
et
to
de lui
give them
permettre
back
de
their
s'exprimer
voice,
librement
to enable them
pour
to
reprendre en main
freely voice their
son
views,
destin.
to take
Telle est,
ownership of
Monsieur le
their
Président, la
destiny.
boussole qui guide
Therein
l'action
lies
de la
the
France.
compass which
Je vous remercie.
guides France's initiatives. Thank
Doy
you.
las gracias al señor representante de Francia.
I thank the representative of
Ahora
France.
doy la palabra al señor
I now
representante
give
de
the floor
Perú.
to the representative
Señor
of Peru.
presidente,
Mr.
el
President,
Perú no ha acompañado el
Peru
proyecto de resolución
did
propuesto
not
en atención a los siguientes
vote
elementos.
in favor of the resolution for the following
Porque no toma en
reasons, because
cuenta
it does not take
los
into
elementos
account
básicos del problema
the
en
basic
Venezuela, que son
aspects
la
of the problem in
existencia de un
Venezuela, which is the
régimen
existence
ilegítimo
of an
que ha
illegitimate
provocado una de las
regime
más graves
which has
crisis
provoked one of the most
humanitarias
serious
y éxodo en la
humanitarian
historia de la
crises
región,
and exoduses in the region,
producto de su desastroso
a
manejo
result of its
económico y
disastrous
corrupción.
economic management and corruption.
Tampoco toma en cuenta las
It also
flagrantes
did not take into
violaciones a
account
los
the
derechos
flagrant
humanos y las
violations of
libertades
human rights and
individuales,
individual freedoms,
ni la urgencia de celebrar
or the
elecciones libres.
urgency of holding free
El Perú
elections.
ratifica su
Peru
pleno compromiso con la
is
Carta de las
fully
Naciones
committed
Unidas y con sus
to the
principios y
Charter of the United
propósitos.
Nations and its purposes
Sin
and
embargo,
principles. We
no
ratify
podemos
that.
aceptar una
But we
aproximación
cannot
que considere
accept an
solo
approach
alguna de las
which
disposiciones de
only
la
looks
Carta
at some
que
provisions of the
estimamos
Charter
relevantes para este caso.
which seem to be relevant for this
Tampoco
case.
podemos apoyar la
We
búsqueda
can't
de
support either
inconducentes mecanismos de diálogo
mechanisms,
que han fracasado de
dialogue
manera
mechanisms that have
recurrente
failed
en virtud
repeatedly
de la comprobada falta de
because of the
compromiso del
proven
régimen
lack of
ilegítimo,
commitment of the
los cuales han
illegitimate
sido utilizados
regime.
solo para
They
ganar
have been
tiempo,
used only to
perenizarse
gain
en el
time
poder
and to
y
stay in
arremeter
power
posteriormente con nuevos atropellos y
and to
violaciones a los
continue
derechos
with
humanos.
new violations
El Perú
of human
cuestiona la
rights.
voluntad
Peru
de un régimen
questions the
que,
willingness
como hemos
of a
visto el
regimen,
fin de
a
semana
regime which, as
y
we have
escuchado en
seen
este
at the
Consejo
weekend
hace
and
2
as we've
días,
heard 2
no
days
solo
ago in
se
this council,
opone al
is not only
ingreso de la
opposed to
necesitada
the
asistencia
entry of the
humanitaria,
required
sino que niega
humanitarian
la
assistance,
existencia
but
de la
it denies
emergencia y
the
la crisis
existence of
e
an
ignora
emergency
y
and a
no le
crisis.
preocupan
It ignores the
los
situation and is not concerned
3.4
about the
millones de sus
3.4
ciudadanos
million of its
que han tenido que
citizens
huir de la
who have
tragedia
had to
provocada
flee
por Nicolás
the
Maduro. Muchas gracias.
disaster created by Nicolás Maduro.
Le
Thank
agradezco
you.
al señor representante de
Thank
Perú
the
por su
representative
intervención.
of
Ahora paso
Peru
la
for his
palabra a la
statement.
señora
I now give the
representante
floor
de
to
Polonia.
the representative of Poland.
Thank you, Mr. President. Poland voted in favor of U.S. draft resolution on Venezuela. We have decided to support the resolution as we believe that it is a primary responsibility of the Council to address urgently the worsening humanitarian crisis affecting millions of Venezuelans. The crisis, which is further exacerbating by blocking by pro-Maduro's security forces the delivery of humanitarian aid. Every day without the aid is a day with more and more people suffering, including children, because of the lack of basic services, food and medicines. Therefore, we regret that not all members of the Council decided to engage in the consultation process. Another division among the Council members sends a negative message to a place that deserves better. At the same time, Poland has decided to vote against the Russian draft as it lacked basic and most important element on acknowledgement of the humanitarian catastrophe. We also reject the notion that responding to the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela undermines its sovereignty. Quite the contrary, let me stress that it is in the Council's responsibility and its legitimate concern in line with the UN Charter to address the situations, just like now in case of Venezuela, which endanger the maintenance of international peace and security. Moreover, it is in response to call from the legitimate authorities of Venezuela. In conclusion, Mr. President, what really matters is the suffering of the people of Venezuela. They deserve the better future. We do hope that we will manage to meet their rightful expectations. Thank you.
Doy las gracias a la señora
I
representante de
thank
Polonia
the
por su
representative of
intervención.
Poland for her statement.
Ahora paso la palabra
I now
al señor
give the floor
representante
to
de
the
Sudáfrica.
representative of South Africa.
Mr. President, the text presented by the Russian Federation is consistent with the South African Constitution and values and principles of democracy founded on the rule of law. At the international level, the Russian text assesses the principles of UN Charter and reinforces the founding principles of the United Nations based on the sovereign equality of all its member states. This resolution speaks to the principle of peaceful settlement of international disputes in line with the provision of Article 2.3 and Chapter 6 of the Nation Charter on the peaceful settlement of dispute. Furthermore, the Russian resolution reiterates the need to fully respect the principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence for the provision of international humanitarian assistance. The Russian text is a reaffirmation of the principle of the Charter of the United Nations, which enjoys universality in terms of its scope and application. It was on this basis that South Africa supported the resolution. Mr. President, ultimately, South Africa will encourage that any further action by this Council should be guided by the genuine process to maintain national peace and security and promote unity of purpose in this regard. I thank you.
Muchas gracias, señor representante de Sudáfrica, por
Thank
su
you
intervención.
very much to the representative of
Ahora
South
doy la
Africa for
palabra
that
al
statement.
señor
I now
representante
give
de
the floor to
Indonesia.
the representative of Indonesia.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Mr. President, Indonesia's position on the situation in Venezuela has always been consistent, clear, and principled. We have had the opportunity to express our position on this particular matter a number of times. Indonesia regrets that we cannot achieve unity in the Security Council on how to address the situation in Venezuela. The fact that we are having two separate draft resolutions is a clear evidence of the lack of sense of unity among the Council members, which is sad. I must humbly submit in my less than 2 months in the Council that this is a sad day for the international community, particularly for the people of Venezuela. This is undoubtedly a collective failure, a failure of us 15 that are seated in this table. Because we all came here today knowing that we would not reach the needed consensus for the adoption of a resolution. I would like to address the failure to reach consensus solution as follows. In the first instances, both draft resolutions are incomplete, as they are not comprehensive enough and have become overly politicized. Thus, both drafts would neither be useful nor helpful to the course of ensuring the interests of the people of Venezuela. Both drafts give little attempt to finding a consensus on this highly sensitive matter. The need for flexibility in the Council and priority on reducing tension in Venezuela are of the essence. We would have liked to see more balanced and all-embracing draft. We would also have valued a more thorough consultation preparatory process involving all parties in the discussion. Now, Mr. President, the situation in Venezuela is still worrying, and thus the need for the Council to be united and take the right actions comprehensively and not exacerbate the situation. In doing so, Indonesia has always taken the principled stance that in order to achieve durable solution, the following points should be taken into account. First, the principle of non-interference, sovereignty, and territorial integrity in line with the UN Charter should be honored. It should always be a starter in discussing any issues in the framework of the United Nations. Second, any solution should focus on an inclusive political dialogue involving all parties. There is an urgent need to address the large trust deficit, and therefore we call all parties to accept the good offices offered by the Secretary General and restrain from taking action that will further deteriorate the already fragile situation on the ground. Third, there is urgency to address humanitarian need of the people of Venezuela, which is in dire need of humanitarian assistance. The United Nations must play an important role in deliverance and organizing support for humanitarian assistance. Fourth, the plight of Venezuela refugees affecting neighboring countries has to be urgently addressed. Now, these 4 points should be the element of a good consensual Security Council resolution. And without these elements, Indonesia refused to accept or reject both resolutions because they are flawed. If we really care about the people of Venezuela, then we should have a united front and find a joint solution. We continuously expressed the view of having a united front, and we have not done so. Mr. President, in all honesty, I have to admit that my delegation is starting to believe that dialogue and negotiation are a luxury here in the Council. I was wondering as to how the Council can promote dialogue for a universally acceptable solution if its members have difficulty to sit together and have a dialogue in finding common ground. We beseech our colleagues to put aside their differences. Now is not the time to be divided by political rhetoric. Let us spare no effort to ensure that we will be part of the solution and not be part of the problem. Despite the deeply diverging views in the Council, Indonesia is of the view that it is still possible for us to arrive at a consensus in the future, as long as the Council lives up to its mandate and responsibility. We have still an unfinished business, and that is to assist Venezuela and its people to find a peaceful solution to their current challenges. I thank you, Mr. President.
Muchas gracias, señor representante de Indonesia, por su
I
intervención.
thank the representative of
Ahora paso
Indonesia
la palabra
for your
al señor
statement. I now give the
representante
floor to
de la
the
Federación de Rusia.
representative of the Russian Federation.
Благодарю вас, господин
Thank you,
председатель.
Mr. President.
Мы глубоко
We
сожалеем, что
deeply
Совет
regret the fact
Безопасности
that the
вновь
Security Council
оказался
has once again found
втянут
itself
в это политическое
dragged
шоу и
into
авантюру.
this political show and misadventure.
Представленный американской делегацией проект был написан
The
для
draft
смены
submitted
режима.
by the U.S.
Под прикрытием
delegation was
заботы о
written for
людях.
regime change,
Мы все это уже
disguised
видели.
as care for people. We've seen
Применительно к
all of
Ливии,
this already,
Ираку,
vis-a-vis
Сирии,
Libya,
Афганистану.
Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan.
Мы уже принимали
We have
резолюцию
already
Совета
adopted a
Безопасности
Security
по
Council resolution
Ливии,
on Libya,
которая
a
была
resolution that
нечистоплотно
was
использована для
unscrupulously
бомбардировок
exploited
и
for
зверской смены
bombings
режима.
and brutish regime change.
К чему это привело, мы все сегодня знаем.
The damage that this has wrought is now known to all of us.
Где теперь Ливия?
Where is Libya now?
Что с ней?
What has happened to Libya?
И что с африканскими
And what
странами,
of
по
those
которым
African
расползся
countries which
террористический
are gripped
интернационал
by
из
the
Ливии?
tentacles of international terrorism from Libya?
Вашингтон и Лондон
Washington
вновь
and
ограбили
London
целую
have
нацию
once
на
again
миллиарды
robbed an
долларов
entire
и
nation
насильно
of billions of
навязывают
dollars
подачки,
and are
которые обставляют
forcibly
условиям смены режима.
imposing handouts which are contingent upon
Вы
regime
сначала
change.
создаете колоссальные
First,
гуманитарные
you
проблемы, а потом
create
призываете
colossal
мир их
humanitarian
решить.
problems, and then you call upon the world to resolve them.
Мы вынужденно применили право вето, поскольку
We were
американский
forced
проект не
to
нацелен
exercise the right to a
на
veto
решение
because
проблем
the
Венесуэлы,
U.S. draft is not geared
Поэтому мы
towards resolving
предложили
the problems in
альтернативный
Venezuela. For
проект
this reason, we
резолюции,
proposed an alternative
который мог
draft
бы помочь
resolution, a draft
венесуэльцам
resolution that could have
самостоятельно,
helped the
без
Venezuelan
внешнего
people
вмешательства решить свои
independently,
проблемы.
without foreign intervention, to resolve their problems.
Сегодня многие делегации
Today,
говорили,
many
что надо как можно
delegations have
скорее
said that it's
провести в
necessary as soon
Венесуэле
as
выборы.
possible to hold elections in Venezuela.
Выборы или не выборы,
Elections or
это
no
решать самим
elections,
венесуэльцам.
this is a decision to be taken by the
Не надо
Venezuelan people
решать за них.
themselves. Do not decide for them.
Главное это диалог.
Most important
А вы
is
сжигаете мосты в прямом
dialogue,
и
and
переносном
you
смысле этого
are
слова.
literally and figuratively burning
В нашем
down
документе
bridges.
содержалась
Our
поддержка
document
механизма
contained
Монтевидео.
support for the Montevideo
Но диалог и
mechanism. However,
последовательность
dialogue
это
and
явно не
mediation
то, к чему стремится
clearly
Вашингтон и те
are
делегации, которые
not
его
what
поддерживают.
Washington and those delegations supporting it are not what they are
Мы
aiming
сегодня
for.
слышали из уст
Today
уважаемого
we've
представителя
heard
Соединенного
uttered
Королевства
by the distinguished
старую
representative of the
песню.
United Kingdom an old song.
Российский проект не
The
прошел,
Russian
а
draft
американский
wasn't
был
passed,
заветирован.
and the U.S. was vetoed.
Собственно, ради этого и
So for
затевалась
the
вся эта
sake of
комбинация.
this entire thing
Завтра об этом
was
будут трубить
concocted.
СМИ.
And tomorrow this will
В то время
be
как о том,
making
что наш
front
проект
page
был
headlines.
убит,
And yet the fact that
не
our
будет
draft was
сказано ни
killed,
слова.
that won't be mentioned at all.
Это уже было раньше, мы это все знаем и
And
помним.
we
Это было
recall
сделано
and we remember that
преднамеренно.
this was done in the past. This was done deliberately.
Именно для этого.
Specifically for this
Вы намеренно
purpose,
разрушаете
you are
единство Совета, как здесь
deliberately
сегодня уже об этом
fracturing
говорилось.
the
И
unity
уже
of
не
the council,
первый
as
раз.
has been mentioned today, and it's not the first time that you are doing so.
Против нашей резолюции проголосовало 70 членов Совета
70 members of the
Безопасности,
Security Council vote,
связанных
17
блоковой
vote
дисциплиной,
against
в той или иной
our
степени, в той или
resolution,
иной группе.
and this was an
Между
alliance-based
тем, как
thinking,
число поддерживающих
alliance-based discipline, whereas
даже не
the
столько
majority of those who
Венесуэлу, а
support
международное
not
право
even Venezuela, but international law.
гораздо больше. И как минимум
There are
60,
far
что
more of
показала
those, at
недавняя
least
встреча по
60,
Венесуэле,
as has been
которую вы
reflected by the
проводили.
recent
На
meeting
самом
in
деле
Venezuela, which we
гораздо
held.
больше.
Indeed, the
Большинство
numbers
из
are
них
far
сидят все
greater.
здесь, в этом
More than
зале.
100 of them are here, seated in
Сегодняшнее
this chamber.
голосование – это яркий
Today's
пример того,
vote
для
is a
чего
glaring
необходимо право
example of
вето.
Why the veto is
Чтобы отстоять
necessary
мир
in order
и
to
право
uphold
народов
peace
самим решать
and
свою
the
судьбу.
right of peoples to determine their
Сегодня
own
было очевидно, что
fates.
безответственного
Today it
использования
was
этого
made
права
evident that had
Совет
this right
сам
not
рискует
been
превратиться в
conscientiously
угрозу миру и
exercised, then the council
безопасности.
itself would risk transforming itself into a threat
Хорошо,
to
что
peace
сегодня
and
этого не
security.
произошло.
It's a good thing that this did not happen
Благодарю вас.
today. Thank you.
Doy las gracias al señor
I
representante
thank
de la
the
Federación de
representative
Rusia por
of
su
the Russian
intervención.
Federation for his statement.
Doy ahora la palabra al
now
señor
give the floor
representante
to the
de la República
representative of the
Bolivariana de
Bolivarian
Venezuela.
Republic of Venezuela.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Venezuela se encuentra hoy
Venezuela
en estado de paz,
today
preservada
is
por el
completely
gobierno
at peace,
constitucional
a peace
del
preserved
presidente
by the
Nicolás Maduro,
constitutional
quien
government
está
of
en
President
pleno
Nicolás
ejercicio
Maduro,
de sus
who
facultades
is in full
legales
exercise
y
of his
garantiza la
legal
protección del
powers,
territorio
and
y del
who
pueblo
guarantees the
venezolano
protection
con
of
el
national
control
territory
efectivo
as well as the
del país.
well-being of the Venezuelan people and
Repetimos,
effective control
no
over the
hay
country. Let me
ningún
repeat,
tipo de violencia
there is
dentro de
no
Venezuela.
type of
Si
violence in
existen
Venezuela.
amenazas
If
contra
there
la
are
paz,
threats
estas
against
vienen del
peace,
exterior.
those threats come from
En
abroad.
relación con el proyecto presentado por los
With
Estados
regards
Unidos
to
por
the draft
el gobierno
resolution
del
presented
presidente
by the
Trump,
United States and the government of
denunciamos,
President Trump,
primero,
we
que se
denounce, first of
falsifique
all,
el
that it
contenido de las
falsifies the
resoluciones
content
mencionadas en ese
of
proyecto
resolutions mentioned
de la
in that
Organización de
resolution
Estados
of the
Americanos,
Organization of
pues
American
la propia
States,
carta de
because
esa
the
organización
very charter of
regional
that regional organization
establece que los estados no tienen
establishes that
autoridad
states do not
para
have the
determinar
authority to
la legitimidad
determine the
de los procesos
legitimacy
electorales
of the
de otro
electoral
país.
processes of another
Esa
country.
autoridad no existe.
That authority does not exist.
Y si un grupo de países
And if
decidió
a group of
desconocer los
countries
resultados
decided
electorales,
to ignore
lo
the
hizo en
electoral
su
results
capacidad
of President
nacional,
Maduro, they
lo
did
cual
so
no
in their
tiene
national
efecto alguno
capacity,
en ese foro
which
regional.
has no
Se trata de
regional
una acción fallida
application at all.
de agresión
This is a
política, pues
failed
hoy nuestro país
operation.
ejerce
And
plenamente
today, our country
todos sus
fully
derechos
exercises
dentro de la
all its
Organización
rights
de
and
Estados
privileges
Americanos.
within
Por
the
tanto, no es
Organization of American
cierto
States.
que hemos sido
So it's not
sancionados
true
o
that we've been
desconocidos
sanctioned
por la Organización de
or
Estados
ignored
Americanos.
by
Es
the
falso.
OAS.
Y lo
That's
citan como un
false.
ejemplo
And it's
dentro de esa
quoted as
resolución.
an example within that resolution.
También rechazamos que se
We
siga
also
usando a
reject
nuestra Constitución
the fact that
para
our
intentar
Constitution
justificar
continues to
una
be used to
intervención
attempt to justify
colonial,
a colonial intervention,
apoyando a una entidad
supporting a
ficticia que no
fictitious
existe
entity
en nuestra
which
ley
does not
fundamental.
exist in our
Un
basic law.
gobierno autoproclamado
A
es una
government of a
dictadura sin base legal en
self-proclaimed
Venezuela.
leader is a dictatorship
Incluso sus
without legal
voceros
basis in
ya
Venezuela.
abandonaron toda intención
And their
de llamar a
spokespeople
elecciones
have also
y
abandoned all
pretenden actuar
intentions to
por
call
años
elections
sin consultar al pueblo.
without
A a ellos
insulting
solo
the
le
people.
basta el apoyo del presidente Trump.
All they have is the support
Los
of
países
President
europeos
Trump. European
que acompañan
countries
al gobierno del presidente Trump en
who
esta
are assisting the
aventura
United States
lo
in this
hacen
adventure
a pesar de que
are
sus
doing it
expertos
despite the
legales
fact
de
that their
sus
legal
propios
experts
parlamentos
of their
les
own parliaments
advierten
have warned
que
them
la injerencia en nuestros asuntos
that
internos,
interfering in our
así
domestic
como sus
affairs,
acciones
as well
coercitivas
as their
ilegales,
coercive illegal
constituyen
action,
actos hostiles
constitute
contra
hostile
nuestra nación.
acts against our
La comunidad
nation.
internacional
The
no puede entender
international
cómo el
community
Consejo de
cannot
Seguridad
understand how
permite
the
la
Security
violación
Council
deliberada de la
can
Carta
permit the
Fundamental
deliberate
de la ONU
violation of the fundamental
por parte
charter
de
of the
miembros
United
que tienen
Nations,
como
and that
obligación
be done by
hacerla
those that
cumplir.
have the obligation
Señor
to ensure
presidente,
that the charter is complied with.
denunciamos que
Mr.
no se haya
President,
hecho
we denounce the
mención
fact that
a
no
los
mention
actos
has been
violentos que
made of the
ocurrieron el pasado
violent
fin de
acts that
semana
took place
desde
last
territorio
weekend
colombiano
from
hacia
Colombian territory
territorio
towards
venezolano.
Venezuelan
Esto
territory.
fue un incidente
This
internacional
was an
y no uno
international
nacional.
incident and
Se
not a
trata
national
de,
incident.
como incidente internacional,
And
de
being
un
an
asunto que
international
es
incident,
responsabilidad
this is
de
the
este Consejo de
responsibility of
Seguridad,
this Security
pero ha
Council,
sido
but
deliberado,
it has
ignorado
been
deliberadamente.
ignored.
El gobierno de Colombia hasta hoy
The government of
no ha presentado
Colombia,
los protocolos y
even
las
up
fotografías
to
que amenazó
today, has not
hace varios
given us
días
the
iban a
photographs and
probar
supposed
que se trataba
protocols
de una
that would
operación
show that this
humanitaria
was a
y no de una
humanitarian
agresión. Todavía
operation
estamos
and
esperando
not an
las supuestas
aggression.
pruebas.
We are still
No hay
awaiting
ley
this
internacional,
evidence.
señor
There is
presidente,
no
que
international law,
permita
Mr.
a un
President,
gobierno
which
cualquiera
allows a
que
government
se
of any
presente en la
kind
frontera de
to
otro
show
país
up at the border with another
intentando
country
forzar
and
en
attempt
ese
to force
territorio
its way
extranjero
into that foreign
el ingreso
territory
de una carga
and force in
desconocida
an
con
unknown
unos
cargo
protocolos
with
desconocidos.
using unknown
3 días después
protocols.
del ataque,
3 days after
todavía
the
permanecen
attack,
en esos puentes grupos de
on
enmascarados
those
protegidos por el
points there are
gobierno de
still
Colombia, lanzando bombas incendiarias desde
people with
territorio
masks on
colombiano
throwing
a las
bombs
fuerzas
into
del orden
Venezuelan
público en
territory.
Venezuela. Y todavía no hemos visto
And
una
we still
sola
haven't seen
mención
any
y
not a
menos
single
todavía
mention
una
of this
condena
or any
a estas
condemnation
agresiones.
of these aggressions.
Queremos que el mundo sepa
We want the world to know
que cuando expresan algunos países acá
that when some countries
preocupación por
here
la
are
situación
expressing
humanitaria de
concern about
Venezuela,
the humanitarian
nunca se
situation
refieren
in
a las
Venezuela,
causas del
they never
problema.
refer to the
Es
causes of the
ilegal
problem.
que se cometan actos
It's
de guerra
illegal that
económica
acts of
contra nuestro
economic
país,
war be conducted
violando
against
los
our
derechos
country,
humanos de
violating
nuestro pueblo,
the human rights of our
usándolos como
people,
rehenes en una
using them as
política de
hostages
crueldad
in a
calculada,
policy
en
of
total violación de la Carta de las
calculated
Naciones
cruelty
Unidas,
in
y que al
violation of
mismo
the United
tiempo,
Nations
después de esa
Charter.
política de crueldad
And
calculada, se
in addition to
oculte
that
la
calculated
responsabilidad
cruelty,
de los principales agentes del crimen,
they
quienes
deny
son,
that
los vamos a nombrar
those
acá, el gobierno de
responsible
Estados
of
Unidos y el
the
gobierno del
crime,
Reino Unido.
and I'll name them here, the governments of the United States
Denunciamos
and the United
igualmente
Kingdom.
que esas dos
We also
potencias
denounce the fact
coloniales,
that these two colonial
una
powers,
todavía muy fuerte y
one of
otra
them
en
still very
decadencia,
strong, another one in decline,
perpetraron en una semana, hace
in
apenas
the
2
course of
semanas,
one,
en una semana,
not even
el
2 weeks,
robo más
1
grande
week,
en nuestra
carried out
historia.
the biggest
Más de 30
robbery of
mil
our country.
millones
More
de
than
dólares
$30
se robaron al pueblo
billion
venezolano
was stolen from
y
the
quieren
Venezuelan
hacer
people.
invisible ese despojo de proporciones
And they want
históricas.
to justify
Si
this
tienen real interés
theft. If
por la
they really
situación
are
humanitaria y
interested
por
in
el
the
bienestar del pueblo
humanitarian situation and the
venezolano,
well-being
lo
of the
primero que
Venezuelan
deben
people, the
hacer es
first thing that they
devolver
should
lo
do
que se robaron.
is return what they
Los
stole.
Estados Unidos y el Reino
The
Unido
United
cometen
States
una
and the
acción de
United
rapiña
Kingdom
y pillaje
were
que
involved
no
in
puede ser
theft and
ocultada
plunder,
con un
which
manto
cannot
de
be
humanitarismo.
hidden under the cloak
Es el
of
mismo saqueo
humanitarian aid.
colonialista de hace 2 siglos,
It's the same
pero
as
ahora
the
disfrazada
covetous
con una ideología
colonialism
racista,
of 2 centuries ago,
mesiánica,
but today
que
it's
se
disguised with
autoproclama
a
como
salvation
salvadora de los países del
ideology
tercer
of
mundo.
Messianic
Señor presidente, nosotros
messianic
no necesitamos
salvation
esos
of
salvadores.
those in the third world. We
Nosotros
don't need these
necesitamos esos
saviors, Mr.
salvadores
President.
guiados por la codicia que terminan destruyendo
These
toda
covetous
nación donde se
saviors will
acercan. Nosotros no
end up
necesitamos esos
destroying
salvadores.
every nation that they
En este
enter. We do
momento
not need these saviors.
están ejecutando una masiva
At this
operación de
point in time,
extorsión
they are
contra
involved in
todos
massive
aquellos países que
extortion
están
against all
comerciando
countries who are
legalmente con
legally
Venezuela.
trading with
Los
Venezuela.
Estados Unidos y Europa no son un gobierno
The
mundial
United
sobre el
States and
comercio en el
Europe are
resto
not
del
a
mundo.
world
Y
government
sus actos
governing
ilegales
trade
son la primera
throughout the
causa de
world.
sufrimiento de nuestro pueblo.
And these illegal acts are
Este
causing
Consejo de
suffering for our
Seguridad debe
people.
velar por
This
el
Security
cumplimiento del
Council
derecho
must
internacional
ensure
frente al
that
uso de las
we
instituciones
comply with
económicas
international
internacionales
law
como arma de de destrucción masiva
and that
y
we
por parte de los
combat
Estados Unidos y el
these
Reino
weapons
Unido.
of mass
Las
destruction being
guerras
employed by the
modernas, señor
United States
presidente,
and
ya
the
no se hacen
United
solo con
Kingdom.
bombas, también se
Wars
hacen
are
con
not,
bancos.
not
Están
just
usando
conducted
bancos
with
para
bombs.
destruir a nuestro pueblo.
Wars are also conducted with
Señor
banks, and banks are
presidente,
being used
si la
to
primera función de
conduct
este
war against
órgano
our people.
es el mantenimiento de la
If
paz y la
indeed, Mr.
seguridad
President, the
internacionales,
main function of this
el mundo
body
no
is
puede
to
entender
maintain
por qué el
international peace
gobierno
and
del
security,
presidente
nobody
Trump
will understand why
se
the government
niega
of
a
President Trump
aprobar una
denies,
resolución que prohíba el
refuses to
uso
approve a
y la amenaza
resolution
del
which
uso de la
prohibits
fuerza en el
the
caso
use and the
venezolano.
threat of use of force when
¿Saben
it
por qué
comes
no
to
lo hace?
Venezuela. You know why
Porque
they
el
don't do
presidente
this?
Trump sigue
Because
amenazando
President Trump is
públicamente al
continuing
pueblo
publicly to
venezolano con la
threaten the
opción
Venezuelan
militar.
people with
Es
the
inmoral,
military
es
option. It's
irresponsable
immoral, it's
extorsionar a todo un
irresponsible
pueblo
to
en
extort
total
money
violación
from a
del
whole
derecho
people in
internacional y de
complete
la Carta
violation of
Fundamental de las
international
Naciones
law and the
Unidas.
fundamental charter
Ayer,
of the United Nations.
el presidente
Yesterday,
de Costa Rica
the president of Costa
señaló que
Rica
no se unió al comunicado
indicated
emitido
that
por
he
el
could
grupo de
not
países que se reunieron el pasado lunes en Bogotá
agree to the
para discutir
communique
la situación
emitted
venezolana,
in Bogotá
porque
last
abiertamente en
Monday
esa
with regard to
reunión
the situation
se
in
trató
Venezuela,
el tema del
specifically
uso de la
because at that
fuerza
meeting
militar contra
they
Venezuela.
discussed military
Y
force
tanto
against
Costa
Venezuela,
Rica como
and
otros
both Costa
países de la
Rica
región
as well as other
se
countries of the
niegan a
region
apoyar la
are
violencia de
refusing to
Estados
support
Unidos
the
y sus
violence
aliados
of the
contra
United
nuestro
States and their
pueblo.
allies against our
Queremos
people.
denunciar, esto es muy importante
We would like
denuncia,
to
señor presidente.
denounce, it's very important to
Queremos
denounce,
denunciar que
Mr.
hay una
President, we'd like to
permanente amenaza
denounce the
militar
fact that there
contra
is an
Venezuela.
ongoing military
Por esa
threat
razón,
against
el Reino
Venezuela.
Unido tenía
That's
un
why
barco
the
de guerra
United
el
Kingdom
pasado
had a
sábado a menos
warship
de
last
80
Saturday
kilómetros
that
de
was
nuestras
located at
costas
less than
y
80
todavía hoy
kilometers
no ha
off our
podido
coast,
justificar su
and they still
presencia.
haven't been able to
Por esa
justify
misma
their
razón, los
presence.
Estados Unidos
For the
hicieron
same reason,
alarde
the
de
United
movimiento de
States
tropas en territorio
was involved in
colombiano
a display of
cerca de
troop
nuestra
movements on
frontera,
the
al
Colombian
mismo
side,
tiempo
close
que
to our
amenazaban
border,
de muerte
at the
a
same
nuestro
time
jefe de
that they were
Estado.
threatening to kill our head of
Denunciamos
state.
igualmente
We
que
also
voceros del gobierno
denounce
del
that
presidente
US
Trump
spokespeople
están en
working
este
for President
momento
Trump are
fabricando
currently
una narrativa de
fabricating
una
a
cantidad
narrative of a
absurda de
number, an
supuestos
absurd
desertores
number
de
of
la Fuerza
supposed
Armada Nacional
deserters from the
Bolivariana,
Bolivarian Armed
todo con el
Forces,
objeto de
all with the
justificar
aim
la
of
conformación
justifying
de
the
un
standing
supuesto
up
ejército
of
de
a
liberación de
so-called
Venezuela en
Liberation
territorio
Army of
colombiano,
Venezuela
todo
in
con la intención de
Colombia,
infiltrarse en nuestro país y destruir
with
la
the aim
paz
of
de nuestra
infiltrating our
nación.
country and
Los
destroying the peace of
organizadores
our
de este
nation.
grupo armado criminal
This is a
hacen alarde
criminal
público en los
group,
medios de comunicación de Colombia con total impunidad. Son
and
datos públicos, no estamos hablando de que tenemos información
and we hear
secreta.
about them in
Vamos a
Colombian
pasarle toda la información.
media. This is no
Ya no se trata
secret.
del uso público de la fuerza militar,
This is
sino de su uso clandestino
a clandestine
en una guerra
use
con mercenarios
of,
pagados, del
militaries.
mismo modo que
These
se
are
ejecutó en
mercenaries,
Nicaragua
just
en
the
la
same
cruel
as we
guerra
saw
de los
in
contras.
Nicaragua in the cruel Contra War.
Cruelmente, señor presidente, el encargado por parte de Estados
It's very
Unidos
cruel, Mr.
que estuvo
President, that
de esa operación
the
de
person
los
in
contras en
charge of that
Nicaragua fue el
Contra
señor Elliot
operation in
Abrams, que está aquí
Nicaragua was
presente.
Mr. Elliot Abrams,
El
who's with
mismo
us
que
here
hoy es
today.
responsable
He's
de
the
la
same
operación
one who
contra
is responsible
Venezuela.
today in
Es el
charge
mismo
of the
que
operation
usó
against
aviones
Venezuela.
cargados con armas,
The same one that
disfrazados
used
de ayuda humanitaria para
planes
estimular la
laden
muerte y la
with
destrucción en
arms
Nicaragua.
disguised
Y
as
él quiere que
humanitarian
nosotros
aid to bring
creamos
about
que está
death and
muy
destruction
interesado
in
en enviar
Nicaragua.
ayuda
And now
humanitaria
we're
a
supposed to
Venezuela
believe that
con
he's so
enmascarados
interested in
lanzando
humanitarian
cócteles Molotov.
aid in Venezuela, but what we're
Señor
seeing is
presidente,
people
para
throwing Molotov
terminar,
cocktails into our country.
exigimos de este Consejo
In
de
conclusion,
Seguridad
Mr. President,
un
we
claro
demand of the Security
pronunciamiento
Council a clear
condenando
pronouncement
y prohibiendo
against
el
the
uso de la fuerza militar
use and threat of
en
use of
todas sus
military
formas
force
y
in all
maneras
its
en
forms and
contra de Venezuela.
manifestations against
Porque ya
Venezuela.
es público que
Because
los Estados Unidos están
we
en este
know,
momento
it's a public
intentando
knowledge that the United
armar
States is
una
currently
guerra indirecta y
attempting to
mercenaria
arm
con
a
grupos irregulares
clandestine
armados
war
que le
with
permitirá
mercenaries that will
aparecer
enable it
del
to
mismo modo
appear
perverso
in the same
usado en la
perverse way
operación colonial
as it did in
humanitaria
humanitarian
como los
colonial
supuestos
operations in the
salvadores
past
de nuestra
as the
nación.
supposed savior of our nation.
Venimos
In
a
summary,
pedir lo que demandaría cualquier
we are
nación
simply
o
asking
miembro
what any
responsable de las Naciones
responsible
Unidas.
member of the
Venimos
international
a
community
pedir
and the
la
United Nations
defensa
would
de
do.
los
We're asking
principios
for
de
the
nuestra
defense of
Carta
the principles of
Fundacional,
the
como son
founding
el
charter,
respeto a la
namely
soberanía,
respect for
el respeto a la
sovereignty,
independencia política,
political
el respeto a la
independence,
integridad
territorial
territorial,
integrity,
la no
and
intervención en los asuntos
non-intervention
internos,
in
el derecho
domestic
a la
affairs,
autodeterminación
the
de los
right to
pueblos, el
self-determination
derecho
of
a la
peoples,
igualdad
and
jurídica de los
legal
estados,
equality
pero sobre
between
todo,
states.
señor
But above
presidente,
all, Mr.
venimos
President,
a pedirle a este
we've come here to
Consejo
ask
nuestro
this
derecho
Council
a la paz.
for our
Muchas
right
gracias.
to peace. Thank you very much.
De las gracias al señor
I
representante
thank
de la
the
República
representative
Bolivariana de
of the
Venezuela.
Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
La señora representante del Reino
The
Unido
representative
ha
of
pedido
the
la palabra
United
para
Kingdom has
formular
asked for the
una
floor
nueva declaración.
to
Tiene
make
la
a further
palabra.
statement. You have the floor, madam.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'll be very brief, but as a number of lurid claims were made against my country, I'd like to respond very quickly. Firstly, Mr. President, to say that I have sent you a letter in response to allegations made by the Venezuelan representative that sets out very clearly British policy towards his country, and it's very much on the lines of the European Union policy, which we heard about earlier. I think the second thing, Mr. President, to say that if theft and plunder of the Venezuelan people is occurring, it is because of their own government. It's not because of mine. Thank you.
Doy las gracias a la señora representante del Reino Unido. No hay más oradores inscritos en la lista. Se levanta la sesión.
The meeting is adjourned.
Declaro abierta la sesión número
The
8477 del
8477th
Consejo de
meeting
Seguridad.
of the Security Council is called to order.
En el orden del día provisional para esta
The
sesión
provisional agenda for this
figura
meeting
el siguiente tema:
is
la situación en
the
Myanmar.
situation in Myanmar.
Queda aprobado el orden del día.
The agenda is adopted.
De conformidad con el artículo
In
37
accordance
del
with Rule
reglamento
37
provisional
of
del
the
Consejo,
Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure,
invito a los
I invite
representantes
the
de
representatives
Bangladesh
of
y Myanmar
Bangladesh and
a
Myanmar
participar
to
en esta
participate
sesión.
in this meeting.
Así queda acordado.
It is so decided.
En nombre del Consejo,
On behalf of the
doy la
Council,
bienvenida al excelentísimo
I
señor
welcome His Excellency
Sahidul
Mr.
Haq,
Shahidul Haq,
secretario de Relaciones
Foreign Secretary
Exteriores
of
de Bangladesh.
Bangladesh.
De conformidad con el artículo
In
39
accordance with Rule 39
del
of
reglamento
the
provisional
Council's
del
Provisional
Consejo,
Rules of Procedure,
invito a la señora Christine
I invite
Schraner
Madam Christine
Borgener,
Schraner-Burgener,
enviada especial del
Special
secretario